Welcome to Trial Site News podcast series. We're excited to have Linda Lopez-George here with us today. We will be discussing her development of a grassroots initiative to increase awareness of clinical trials to underrepresented groups. So Linda, welcome.
Thank you, Adrian. I appreciate the opportunity to be on this podcast.
The pleasure is ours, and we're excited to have you here. Now, before we deep dive into our topic at hand, I'd like to ask you a personal question about why you have a passion or a keen interest for recruiting or creating a greater awareness for underserved minorities in clinical trials.
Well, as I started learning more about the data in terms of the statistics of how few, in general, adults are eligible and participate in clinical trials, that being under 10%, and then further the abysmal statistic that it's somewhere around 3%, for African Americans and Hispanics. I felt this tug in my heart that particularly in a city like San Antonio, where it's a majority minority city with excellent resources, healthcare, and a Mays Cancer Center, NCI designated, that we needed to do a better job and be a role model, if you will, for the recruitment. In our case, we have a very large Hispanic population, and how could, in my role, I've always been very civic oriented, how could I capitalize on that human capital, if you will, of relationships that I've built over the past, 2 decades in the community to be able to move the needle in our city?
We need more of that. We need more people that are civic oriented, and there's definitely, you can see it here in the States. There's been a push in that direction. So we're proud to see what you're doing here. And on that note, how did you first get involved with clinical research? Tell us about your initial entry into the field.
Well, actually, I got into it on a personal level. When I first started working here at the Health Science Center in 2013, I think the following year, I believe I was either at a run or something, and there was a group of individuals who had a table, and they were trying to recruit participants for a study. And it was a study that was being conducted out of the Mays Cancer Center. And they needed healthy volunteers. They needed a control group. And so I filled out the questionnaire, and I became eligible and started participating in that study. It was a short duration. It was over the summer, I remember, because we were going to Hawaii, and I was concerned that I couldn't participate because I had to be coming in for blood work. And they said, oh, no, that's okay, So we worked around that and still was able to participate. So that was on a personal level. On a professional level, it was when I transitioned to the office of the Vice President for Research in December 2015. And being a liberal arts major, I knew that I had to do a lot of deep diving in a lot of the subjects and units that are under the research infrastructure. And one of them being the clinical research office, the IRB, all of those support offices that support our investigators who are conducting human, we use volunteers in research. And so that's how I got exposed and to the whole area of clinical research. In order to be able to write about it in newsletters, communication pieces, you have to study and become knowledgeable, so then you can feel comfortable speaking about it. And as an example, the SMART IRB. What are the advantages of having the SMART IRB for multi-site studies? And if I want to give recognition to Dr. Kim Summers, who serves as a regional ambassador on the SMART IRB program, you need to then do your homework, because you can't just say, oh, she's the regional ambassador. So what does that mean? Why is that important? Who cares? So you have to do your homework.
Well, absolutely. And when you started doing this, what was your initial experience? What was that like?
it was overwhelming. this whole field of volunteers and humans in clinical research it's daunting because it's a lot to learn, but in another sense, there isn't a lot of literature yet because the field is a fairly nascent field. You know, some of the laws that we have that govern human volunteers in studies, you know, you're talking about the 1970s.
Yeah.
So you're not talking about, these have been in existence for many, many years. And so as issues and needs to address issues in terms of clinical trials, studies are being done. You know, you read about studies that, you know, were done in 2012, 2013, you know, so I say it's daunting because there is literature out there, but it's not like this vast, overwhelming amount of literature. I would say that right now I'm finishing up a certificate program that is offered by Vanderbilt University. It's an online certificate program called Faster Together, Enhancing the Recruitment of Minorities in Clinical Trials. And it reinforces the need to really be knowledgeable and learn best practices, but yet it also brings to light that a lot of these best practices have all been developed within the last decade. So everybody is still learning how to work in this space of underserved populations, the recruitment of minorities in clinical trials, and what are the barriers and how do you facilitate that?
Constantly evolving, right? Now, as you learned about clinical research, when did it become apparent that there were equity challenges? Do you have any observations that you made start thinking about focusing on clinical research serving underserved populations?
Yes, and I think there's a key distinction that I'd like to draw, and that is the difference between equity and equality. Mm-hmm. And I think that in equality being the idea that we can give everyone the same opportunity to be part of a clinical trial. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, equity is actually really focusing on the need to adjust your practices in order to ensure that it really is equality to that process. As an example, in San Antonio, we can go out to a run, as we did with Pop-Up Star, and have, 800 individuals who are exposed to our clinical trials. Mm-hmm. But again, you've assumed that these are individuals who, first of all, had the ability to pay the registration fee to participate in the 5K or 10K. You also have to assume they have the transportation to get there. They did not have an issue with child care because someone was going to take it. If they were mothers and they had children. Right. So those are the equity issues that we need to focus on in order to be able to really say that there is equality when it comes to clinical trials. And learning about this has come through, taking, if you will, these modules, because it's not necessarily something that is intuitive. Mm-hmm. I think many of our investigators, when they create flyers, they're highly educated, and so they write a flyer as though it's an abstract for an NIH grant, as opposed to a flyer for the population they're hoping to bring into that study.
Right. If you're talking over the heads of people, they might just simply miss it.
Correct.
Right. Now, clinical research as a care option has become a more prominent topic lately, as has serving underserved populations. Can you share with our audience some of the reasons why this is the case?
Well, in many cases, especially when testing out a new treatment, clinical trials can increase our access to medical teams and experts that under-resourced populations may not have access to. And under-resourced, simply drawing the point of a fairly new term that's being used is we do have underserved populations, but we also have populations that don't have health care. And so while I may be from an underserved population, if I don't have health care, if I don't have Medicare, if I don't have Medicaid, if I don't have those kinds of insurance plans, then I'm not going to have access all the time to the best patient care treatment available for even just wellness, let alone for a diagnosis of, of diabetes or a diagnosis of COPD or asthma.
Right, and they may not even be getting any medical care.
Correct. So in Texas, with 18% in our state, we're one of the highest uninsured population. It's a way to help people access medical care and link them to people who know of resources that can help them connect to care. And that's important because we are an academic health science center, and our mission is to serve, to educate, of course, but it also has a patient care pillar as well as a research pillar. So how do you tie these three pillars together in order to really be addressing and fulfilling your mission? And so I think the clinical research as a care option for me is like a hand in glove relationship.
Now, on the topic of diversity, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but what is why is diversity so important in clinical trials and research?
Well, the goal of research is to represent the population and to better reflect how a new treatment or an intervention may function at all for all of us, not just those that went through the clinical trial. And if most of our clinical trials are done on a homogeneous population, then a therapeutic that is used on me may not necessarily work for me because I wasn't part of the gene pool, if you will. I didn't have the genetic composition wasn't there when an intervention was being developed.
Right, because humans are so diverse, right?
Correct. So without that diversity, we can introduce a certain level of bias into the study, meaning we're not able to have that accurate reflection on how a treatment might affect different groups. And, the NIH has an act, the Revitalization Act, that requires any federally funded study to include more women and underserved populations in these studies. And that's been relatively successful, but to the level where these groups can actually represent, especially when considering different disease categories being studied, that's still a work in progress, which basically is one of the reasons that last year in May, the NIH launched the All of Us research initiative with the goal of having a minimum of 1 million Americans across the U.S. who will, be part of a database. And that's really important because precision medicine is now one of the key words that is in the healthcare circles. And precision medicine can only work if we have all of us participating in the database, all of us participating in clinical trials, providing that diversity that is needed, so that a drug that works for me and will also work for my husband, who is, Anglo-Saxon, and so his gene pool is much different than my Hispanic gene pool. So that's important.
No, that makes perfect sense. Now, and you touched on this when we talked about the diversity challenge, but why do you think diversity has been such a challenge in clinical trial and research so far? You mentioned, no money not to being able to go to, say, the 5K run, not having insurance, transportation. Could you expand more on that?
Well, I also mentioned and alluded to it that this is a fairly nascent industry in terms of the workforce. Clinical research professionals, when you look at the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, it doesn't have 100-year history. It's a fairly young organization. And I was at their conference in the spring, and that was definitely a subject of focus for the organization, is how do we build the professional competencies? And when you're building the competencies of a profession, you will also then include in those competencies, how do they reach better if I am the clinical research coordinator of this clinical trial, and part of my responsibility is the recruitment and retention of participants, what do I need to know about recruiting and retaining these participants? So again, that knowledge base, those best practices are still sort of bubbling out of the ivory towers, if you will. And so getting that information and knowledge disseminated so that, much like you have to do HIPAA compliance once a year, you have to CME credits to stay current. This is what you need when you're going to have a robust clinical trials infrastructure that brings in diversity, is also to put those competencies into the profession.
So what are some ways that UT Health San Antonio are helping get underserved populations and adding to its diverse research population?
Well, not unlike other organizations and institutions across the country, we're still developing our best practices. It was really important to us earlier this year when we submitted and were chosen to be a pop-up star participant, which is the initiative led by Greater Gift out of North Carolina. And that was real intentional effort on our part to really see if we could internally develop sort of that awareness and willingness, not that we're not collaborative, but just, it takes time to build teams internally. You have to devote time to coming to a meeting, devote time to doing something. And when everyone's busy and has their own projects, it sometimes is not a higher priority. But in terms of the interest and the overwhelming response that we received internally to supporting the initiative, that is an indication that we do want to do a better job in this space of underserved populations. We have some excellent institutes like the MACE and the BIGS, which is Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases, in our bar shop on aging and longevity. And so given the composition, what is known about, Hispanics having a higher indication of dementia and Alzheimer's, that is very much an interest of our director, Dr. Seshadri. And so she, like Dr. Musi at the bar shop on aging, and San Antonio has a very large population of young, but because we are also a mecca for veterans to retire here, that retirement population, just in general, as baby boomers are aging, is growing even more so exponentially. And so there is a lot of interest on our part to really be a role model, a leader in how we can better do the recruitment and the retention of our underserved population. Putting in, looking at data that CISCRP has put out in their latest 2019 study that just came out earlier this fall. Looking at that data, what it indicates is that, when it comes to the minority population, African Americans and Hispanics, there's a real interest on their part to have the information about clinical trials coming from their primary physician or specialist. And so what can we as an institution do to better educate the providers in our community and regionally, because our footprint is larger than just Bexar County. What can we do to really be able to put that information in the hands of clinicians when the African American and Hispanics are saying that's very important for them to get that information from their primary care physician? So those are some of the things that we're looking at now, is kind of what can we do systemically to be able to create that awareness and that knowledge base. How do we utilize technology? How do we utilize databases? Keeping in mind that the user, in this case, the clinician, is very busy. And, as we all know, the business model and the healthcare environment is very dynamic right now, and how they get paid, for outcomes versus just, reimbursement for services. So how does that all play into how then we can work closely with them? So it's going to have to be working with them from the very beginning, just like those patient care advisory groups. We don't really have one that has been designed with sort of the clinical research, clinical trial as a foundation. We have advisory groups, but none that really is focused on, how can an investigator, from before they even are starting to design the protocol, how can they start getting input from the communities that they will want to recruit from. And so again, that's a fairly new initiative in academic centers, as far as creating studios or creating cores that are just focused on this whole vertical, if you will. And so I'm very optimistic, because there's a lot of support internally for how can we do this better, just because we are very committed to the population that we serve.
Right, and that's a crucial component, because when you can try and legislatively force things, but if the heart's not in it, people are going to drag their feet. And in this case, you guys are ahead of the grain here, which is really good stuff. Now, Linda, we know in the past, underserved and diverse populations have had challenging experiences with clinical trials. Now, how have you overcome this fear, and what regulations are in place to protect people against issues from the past?
Right. I think it's very important to always acknowledge that there have been, I don't want to call them abuses, but that there have been points in time in research with human that, are not stellar. But at the same time, we have to know that we have put in place, since the 1970s, there have been multiple laws that govern and must adhere to in terms of humans in clinical trials. And I think that education is something that we have to continuously include in our literature, is, how do I best reassure someone that there are human protection laws, and that there are, that we do have an IRB that is looking always out for the need of the patient. When you put patient advisory groups in place, that also serves as a way to dispel that fear or that wariness about, well, we know what happened back in the 1940s, and and I don't want to be a guinea pig, and those kinds of negative emotional responses, and instead always be able to educate them on the informed consent form and utilize that as a true approach on how the patient is as much a part of the research as the investigator doing it. And so putting them always in that very comfortable atmosphere of being able to ask questions, providing interpreters, not relying on a family member to, who can speak, bilingually and can communicate to the family member or the friend, but actually, respecting the fact that there are some medical terminologies that no one, even if you're fluent, necessarily will understand how to really interpret that, and so an interpreter that is knowledgeable about medical interpretation is much better than someone that's just translating word for word, verbatim.
Right, someone that can take the complex and make it understandable.
Correct. And so I think those are all things that will make someone that has any kind of misgivings or apprehensions about being in a clinical trial know that basically they're in the driver's seat. At any point, they can stop being part of the clinical trial. There's no law that says they must, once they sign, they have to stay in the trial until its conclusion. So I guess, education and on the sensitivity to the population that you're working with, communicating at their level and in their vernacular so that they are comfortable with the trial before they sign.
Absolutely. And on that note, for those that want to get involved with clinical trials, how can people find out about clinical trials and research that's relevant to them?
Well, there's a number of databases that have been created over the past couple of years. Perhaps the one that is, because it is, as a result of NIH and CTSAs throughout the nation, there's about, let's say there's 64 hubs throughout the United States. ResearchMatch.org, which is managed by Vanderbilt University, is an excellent. What I like about it is it is very patient-centered, friendly. It answers a lot of the questions that people may have about, what is a clinical trial? Why would I want to be involved? Those kinds of questions. It's also in Spanish, so that has an advantage over others. Of course, the one that everyone cites because it's required when you're doing a clinical trial that is sponsored is clinicaltrials.gov, and that also has excellent resources about what is a clinical trial and what are the patient's rights, etc. But to me it's not as patient-centered as researchmatch.org. And then the other one for us here in our community, we have created a platform called Find a Study, and that's on our website under the clinical trials page. And that has all the studies that are being done, being led here by an investigator. Even if it's a multi-site study, if one of our investigators is part of that multi-site study and is leading a study here, then it is listed. So it's not this vast wealth of database of thousands and thousands. It's specific to this area. And so that's another resource that someone would have to access. And of course, there's always phone numbers. A lot of times people get lost on websites and they don't want to navigate the website, or they have first some initial questions they want to ask before they actually go on a website and put in their name and their information. So, just there's phone numbers on the website as well that you can call and get some additional information before you actually submit your name and email address and contact information, if you will.
Yeah, which makes sense. It's always easier to reach out and speak to someone directly and then ask your questions.
And sometimes people say, well, I don't have time to belong to a clinical trial. I would encourage people to look at the All of Us, because the All of Us it's just online. It's a health questionnaire. It is lengthy. It will take some time, and you don't complete it sitting down for 10 minutes. But you are adding to a database that is going to be used for studies by investigators toward precision medicine. And of course, that doesn't take any time. And you do that from the luxury of your lazy boy at home, and you don't have to do it all in one sitting too. You can always hit the save and then come back to it later. The other one that's also I have found, because I wanted to navigate it and see what the experience was researchmatch.org. And many times people say, well, I don't have time to travel to go in and be poked and stuff. But there are some studies that are being done that are just online. You fill out a questionnaire, particularly if you're like a healthy volunteer, and you just fill out the questionnaire, and they need them as a control group. Recently I did one related to the topic of experiencing menopause and diabetes. And since I have experienced menopause, but I don't have diabetes, they needed that. They wanted to study the symptoms of one, if they were stronger, if you had diabetes and were going through menopause, or you just went through menopause, so sort of that dichotomy of having a comorbidity, if you will,
Right.
So there's things that you can do to be part of clinical research. And these studies were being done. One was an investigator out of Florida. Another one has been an investigator out of Minnesota. So I'm helping investigators that are not even in my state, but because of the demographics that I filled out on that questionnaire, I'll get an email and I'll say, it looks like you might qualify. And you can always say, no, not interested. And then you have a second opportunity after you say no, and second opportunity to say no, not interested. So by the time you say, yes, I'm interested, you've had several opportunities to say yes. And so again, always very upfront on what they're studying, what your role, what the expectation is. This survey will take 10 minutes. And so there's multiple levels of participation in clinical research. It doesn't have to be a clinical trial where you're actually coming in and being studied at the location where the investigator is, or you're having blood drawn. You know, some people are adverse to having blood drawn any more than they have to. A number of things that you can still do and be advancing research that is going to benefit all of us, whether it's us personally or just the society in general. But a healthy society is powerful, because you can't attract companies to your city if you have a community that is, you know, high incidences of diabetes and high incidences of cancer. Because healthcare being what it is and productivity, people are going to say, well, why would I want to come to a community where population isn't healthy? You know, I'm constantly going to be having sick leave and people out because they're sick.
Absolutely. Now, for a final question, and you've touched on a few things earlier in our interview, but what other strides would you suggest that we could make towards getting diverse populations involved in clinical trials?
I have to applaud C-Script. I think that in the young point in their nonprofit existence, they're doing tremendous work. And I say this in the sense of heightening awareness. You know, nothing is going to raise the visibility of clinical trials and clinical research like, in essence, having it feel more like a movement, you know, where everybody across the United States is working toward this goal. You know, when everybody across the United States is concerned about, you know, smoking or vaping or whatever, it becomes kind of top of mind. And I don't think clinical trials research is top of mind. And so when I say that I applaud the efforts of, you know, C-Script, it's in the sense that, you know, within the last 2 years in particular, they've really taken sort of the show on the road and doing events in communities where they have underserved populations that need to become more engaged and aware about clinical trials. More recently, you know, they're doing an ad, a 4-color ad this month. That's a new initiative. They've put inserts in USA Today. I'm still hoping. I'm going to have to reach out to them and say, how can we get something in San Antonio, because we are the 7th largest city in the United States, and with a majority minority for Hispanics. How can we get an ad in our paper? And I know that it's all kind of driven also as a nonprofit by resources and stuff, but even the services, if you visit their website, they really are addressing services that are needed. One thing that pops up that I think we can do better at, and that is post-trial, post-study, is getting back to those who participated and letting them know what the outcome was of the study. Now, I say that knowing that many times you cannot be very detail-oriented in terms of the study, because there's still a lot of information that is still to be gathered, or data set that still needs to be continued to work on.
Right.
But just some sort of a way to connect back to the volunteer so that the volunteer will be much more likely to want to continue to participate in clinical trials, and then, of course, influence others to participate if their experience was a positive one, in terms of, yeah, I found out, I got a letter and they said that thank you, but you know, C-Script just published their biannual survey responses, and that's still an area that it notes that we all need to work on better at doing, is getting back to our volunteers and letting them know as best as we can what the outcome was of the study that they participated in.
And I think that's smart, especially considering we're in a social media world now where people want to talk about everything that they experience. And so if you have a positive outcome on something, you're going to share it. So, yeah, no, it's smart, and it's very forward-thinking. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, Linda. This is a hugely important issue, and we are very grateful for the work you guys have been doing, so thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to continuing to learn and expand the awareness to our underserved population and under-resourced population.
Well, that's awesome, and we're proud of the work you're doing. Now, for those of you in the audience interested in learning more, you can visit UT Health San Antonio, which will be provided as a link in the description, and all other links will also be provided in the description below. And you can also find Trial Site News on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and the links will also be provided in the description below. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you all next time.